mental illness and violence. And of course, Dr. Poe, let's end this final segment by simply allowing you to inform our audience as much as you possibly can over the next 8 or 10 minutes in terms of what you think that they ought to know from the session that we're having here.
Well, I would say that very often people who act violently are responding in many ways to things that have happened to them in their past, some of which they're responsible for, and other of which they are not responsible for. I would say that oftentimes the violence perpetrator has been a victim, and has been a victim of the violence of other people early on in that person's life. Now, that's not to excuse violence, but oftentimes it's a little bit more complicated. There are a lot of overlapping factors that influence people to engage in violent behavior, and I think one of them is fear. Persons who are brought up in an environment in which they are afraid for their security, they're afraid of being put down, afraid of being punished, afraid of being abused, often become violent as teenagers and become violent as adults. And it's interesting that oftentimes the actions that people engage in to reduce their fear ends up in causing damage to their body and to their mind. For example, drugs that we're seeing that's so widespread today in terms of use and abuse. Oftentimes, teenagers will turn to drugs in their effort to calm their fear, to neutralize their fear, and of course, drug use then causes other problems, oftentimes behavioral problems and violent behavior and criminal activity, because once a person is on drugs, most likely they're going to engage in criminal activity in order to support the drug habit. And so this oftentimes will lead to incarceration. So fear is a major factor, and we discussed once before that fear has many faces. Pain is one of the manifestations of fear. Guilt is a manifestation of fear. Shame is a manifestation of fear, and insomnia may be a manifestation of fear. I think a lot of physical illnesses may be manifestations of fear, and so fear is one of the main emotions that people struggle with, and if a person is not careful, they will find some damaging way in their effort to calm their fear.
And so fear is a real problem in terms of the relationship that a person has not only with others, but the relationship that he has with himself. Is that what we're saying?
Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, there's a relationship between fear and loneliness. And I recall being in a taxi in Houston, Texas, many years ago, and the taxi driver asked me, he said, after finding out that I was a psychiatrist, he said, "What is the major problem that people have today?" And at that time I said, "Depression." He said, "No, I don't think so." He said, "I think it's loneliness."
Okay.
And I think loneliness is often a manifestation of fear.
Well, there's a fear of being lonely. Is
Yes.
That's what we talk about all
right. And I think loneliness is essentially pain. And so there is a fear of being lonely, which is another way of saying there's a fear of pain. And of course, loneliness will drive people most often to do something that's self-destructive. It may be promiscuity, it may be alcohol abuse, it may be drug abuse, it may be overeating. So loneliness